The crystal chandelier above table 4 flickered, casting a sharp glare across Evelyn Carter's diamond watch. 20 minutes. For a woman whose daily schedule was micromanaged down to the single minute, 20 minutes of silence was an insult that carried a heavy financial deficit. She pulled her cashmere coat over her shoulders, her movements deliberate, sharp, and cold. This was the absolute last time she would ever let Claire Bennett arrange her personal life. Evelyn stood up, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor of the Dominion Lounge. She was ready to vanish into the rain-slicked streets of the city, returning to the absolute control of her corporate empire. But before she could take a single step toward the exit, the heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open. Adrian Cole walked in, and the entire room seemed to shift. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit. His button-down shirt was subtly wrinkled at the cuffs, and his breathing was heavy, the shadow of pure exhaustion clinging to his jawline. But what made Evelyn freeze in her tracks wasn't his lack of corporate armor. It was the fact that his left hand was wrapped securely around the small, trembling fingers of a 5-year-old girl. The child, Lily, wore a simple yellow raincoat, her bright eyes darting anxiously around the opulent, intimidating dining room. Adrian didn't offer a frantic apology. He didn't smooth down his hair or look around the room in embarrassment. He walked directly toward Evelyn, met her icy gaze with an unblinking, steady intensity, and spoke with a deep, grounded voice that immediately cut through the ambient chatter of the lounge. "I am not going to offer you a hollow excuse," Adrian said, his voice entirely devoid of the desperation Evelyn usually heard from men trying to impress her. "You are a busy woman, and your time is valuable. But my daughter needed me, and she will always come before anything else. If that means I have already lost my chance with you, I accept that." Evelyn remained frozen, her fingers still gripping the collar of her coat. She looked at Adrian's hands, rough, calloused, with a faint trace of dark grease beneath the nails, the unmistakable hands of a man who worked hard for every dollar. Then she looked down at Lily, who was clutching a small, worn pewter model of a vintage fighter jet, holding it against her chest like a shield. The sheer audacity of his entrance should have infuriated Evelyn. Her entire life was built on strict boundaries, flawless execution, and an absolute refusal to tolerate weakness. Yet, looking at the quiet, protective way Adrian stood between his daughter and the staring patrons, something shifted beneath her armor. It wasn't pity. It was a sudden, jarring curiosity. "Sit down, Mr. Cole," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into its standard boardroom register. "You have exactly 40 minutes left of the hour Claire promised you." Adrian didn't hesitate. He pulled out the plush velvet chair for Lily first, lifting her with an effortless, gentle strength that contrasted sharply with his rugged frame. He whispered something soft into the little girl's ear, causing her anxious expression to melt into a small, trusting nod. Only when his daughter was safe and comfortable did Adrian slide into the seat opposite Evelyn. He placed his large, weathered hands flat on the pristine, white tablecloth. There was no performance here. No desperate attempt to inflate his status, no rehearsed jokes to break the heavy tension. He sat with the absolute stillness of a man who knew exactly who he was, completely unbothered by the fact that his presence was a direct contradiction to the luxury surrounding him. "Claire mentioned you run a business," Evelyn began, leaning back, her eyes narrowing as she began her standard evaluation. "A contracting firm, correct? You build things." "I do," Adrian replied evenly. "I handle residential structures mostly. If a foundation is cracked or a roof is failing, my crew fixes it. It's honest work, and it keeps a roof over Lily's head." "And you brought your work home today?" Evelyn asked, glancing subtly at the faint smudge of dust on his forearm. "An emergency on a job site across town," Adrian said, his eyes never leaving hers. "A structural support beam gave way. I had to stay until the weight was secured. I barely had time to pick Lily up from her afternoon program before driving here." Before Evelyn could respond, a shadow fell over their table. Julian Vance, a ruthless hedge fund manager who had tried and failed to secure a logistics partnership with Evelyn's firm 3 times, stepped into the light. He looked down at Adrian's wrinkled shirt, then at Lily's damp raincoat, a look of pure aristocratic disgust twisting his features. "Evelyn, darling," Julian sneered, loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "I didn't realize the Dominion Lounge had relaxed its dress code just to accommodate the local maintenance staff. If you needed someone to look at your office plumbing, you really didn't have to take them to dinner." The restaurant grew suffocatingly quiet. Evelyn's jaw tightened, her corporate instinct preparing to shred Julian to pieces. But before she could speak, Adrian slowly stood up. He didn't look angry. He didn't ball his fists. Instead, an icy, commanding authority radiated from his posture, a quiet masculinity so powerful it made Julian visibly take a step back. At that exact moment, Adrian's phone buzzed in his pocket. He answered it, his voice dropping into a tone that was completely different from before, sharp, authoritative, and laced with distinct military precision. "Speak," Adrian commanded into the receiver. The voice on the other end was loud enough to leak through the speaker, carrying a tone of sheer panic. "Sir, we have a catastrophic landing gear failure on the private hangar tarmac. The elite transport team is completely frozen. They're saying only one man alive knows how to override the hydraulic lock manually before the system explodes. They need the commander." Adrian's eyes locked onto Evelyn, a profound, unreadable mystery burning in his gaze as Julian stood frozen in shock. Adrian pressed a single button on his phone, his voice dropping an octave into a cold, absolute command. "Secure the secondary pressure line. Tell the ground crew to back away from the nose gear. If they try to force the manual override without the sequence, the entire hydraulic assembly will rupture." "I'm on my way." He cut the call before the person on the other end could answer. The silence that returned to the table was heavier now, charged with a strange, electric current. Julian Vance let out a sharp, mocking laugh, though his eyes darted nervously between Adrian and Evelyn. "The commander? Really? What kind of pathetic charade is this, fellow? Did you hire someone to call you right on cue to save you from looking like a complete loser in front of a CEO? Evelyn, tell me you aren't actually falling for this absolute theater." Adrian didn't even look at Julian. To Adrian, the wealthy hedge fund manager didn't exist. He simply turned his attention downward, where Lily was staring up at him, her small lower lip beginning to tremble. The sharp, aggressive laughter from Julian and the sudden shift in the room's energy had triggered the little girl's anxiety. A single tear tracked through the faint dust on her cheek. She clutched the pewter fighter jet so hard her knuckles turned white. Evelyn watched the transition happen in less than a second. The terrifyingly intense, authoritative man who had just commanded a high-stakes emergency line instantly dissolved. Adrian dropped to one knee on the marble floor, completely unbothered by what the affluent patrons around him thought. He wrapped his large, calloused hands gently around Lily's shoulders, drawing her into a safe harbor. "Hey!" Adrian murmured, his voice a soft, low rumble that seemed to act like a physical blanket against the noise of the restaurant. "Look at me, sweet girl. What's our rule when the wind picks up?" We adjust the wings," Lily whispered, her voice shaking. "That's right," Adrian said, wiping the tear from her cheek with his thumb. His hand was steady, a mountain of quiet masculinity. "We adjust the wings. Daddy has to go fix a big machine down at the airfield. You want to be my co-pilot tonight?" Lily nodded, burying her face into his neck as Adrian stood up, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. Evelyn found herself standing as well. Her mind, usually a fortress of cold calculation, was spinning. She was a master at reading people, at detecting the exact moment someone was playing an angle. But there was no angle here. The raw, genuine warmth Adrian showed his daughter, contrasted against the chilling authority of his phone call, shattered every category she had for men. Julian Vance was still standing there, his face flushed red with indignation at being ignored. "Evelyn, you're smarter than this," Julian snapped, stepping forward. "Don't let this fraud—" "Shut up, Julian," Evelyn said coldly, her voice cutting him off like a guillotine. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Adrian. "Where's the airfield?" "Blackwood Corporate Airport," Adrian said, already moving toward the exit. "Hangar 7. I need to be there in 10 minutes, or a $30 million airframe becomes scrap metal and people get hurt. The rain is getting heavier, and the city traffic is locked down," Evelyn said, her corporate instinct instantly taking over. "My private driver is waiting at the curb in a reinforced navigator. We have executive clearance tags. We'll get you past the gridlock. Let's go." Adrian paused for a fraction of a second, evaluating her. He didn't thank her profusely. He didn't show surprise. He simply nodded once. Then lead the way. The walk through the restaurant was a blur. The wealthy elite of the city watched in stunned silence as Evelyn Carter, the ruthless, unapproachable queen of logistics, walked side by side with a wrinkled shirt contractor carrying a child in a yellow raincoat. Julian Vance was left standing by table 4, utterly humiliated by the casual disregard of two people who belonged to entirely different worlds. Outside, the storm had unleashed a torrential downpour, The neon lights of the city smeared across the wet asphalt. Evelyn's driver, a towering man named Marcus, immediately opened the door of the luxury SUV. Evelyn slid in first, followed by Adrian and Lily. As the vehicle tore through the flooded streets, sirens wailing in the distance, the interior of the SUV became a pressure cooker of unspoken questions. Lily had fallen quiet, holding Adrian's hand tightly as she drifted off into the light sleep of an exhausted child. Evelyn watched them from the shadows of the leather seat. Blackwood Airport is a restricted private facility, Evelyn said softly, her eyes narrowed in deep suspicion. My logistics firm manages freight routing out of there. The general public isn't even allowed past the perimeter gates, and Hangar 7 belongs exclusively to Aegis Aerospace, a black-budget defense contractor. Who are you, Adrian? Adrian looked out the window, the passing streetlights casting long, rhythmic shadows across his rugged face. He didn't answer immediately. He reached down, gently adjusting Lily's yellow raincoat so she wouldn't catch a chill from the air conditioning. I told you the truth, Evelyn, Adrian said quietly. I build things. I fix what's broken. A contractor doesn't get emergency calls about hydraulic landing gear from a defense hangar, she countered, her pulse quickening. A contractor isn't called commander by someone panicking on the phone. Adrian turned his head, his deep, steady eyes meeting hers in the darkness of the vehicle. There are some walls in this world that are built to keep people out, Evelyn. And there are some walls built to keep secrets in. Right now, lives are on the line. The rest can wait. The SUV suddenly lurched to a halt. Marcus turned around from the driver's seat, his face pale. Ma'am, we've hit the main security checkpoint at Blackwood. The military police have the entire sector cordoned off. No one is getting through. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Evelyn saw armored vehicles, flashing red and blue lights, and heavily armed guards blocking the gates. A towering military officer walked toward their vehicle, his hand resting firmly on his sidearm. Adrian didn't panic. He gently transferred the sleeping Lily to Evelyn's arms. Evelyn froze, her heart hammering against her ribs as she held the soft, warm weight of the child. She felt completely helpless, terrified of waking the girl, completely stripped of her corporate composure. Adrian rolled down the window as the armed guard reached the door. The guard looked inside, his expression fierce and unyielding. This is a restricted military emergency zone. Turn this vehicle around immediately, or... Adrian didn't speak. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver coin, holding it flat in the palm of his calloused hand. The guard caught sight of the coin under the flashing emergency lights. Instantly, the man's entire posture shattered. His jaw dropped, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. Slowly, deliberately, the armed officer snapped his hand to his brow in a trembling, ironclad military salute. The guard stepped back, his boots splashing in the deep puddles, and barked into his shoulder radio. Gate primary, override code Alpha 1. Open the barriers right now. Clear the lane. The massive steel gates of Blackwood Corporate Airport groaned open, swinging wide into the darkness. Marcus didn't wait for another order. He slammed his foot on the accelerator and the heavy navigator surged forward past the rows of armored vehicles and into the restricted interior of the airfield. Inside the cabin, the silence was deafening. Evelyn looked from the window back to Adrian, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had negotiated with state governors and international port authorities, but she had never seen a heavily armed military policeman completely shatter his composure over a piece of tarnished silver. What was that? Evelyn asked, her voice tight, dropping the boardroom mask entirely. Adrian, who are you? Military police don't salute contractors, and they don't open black-budget defense facilities for a man with drywall dust on his clothes. Adrian didn't look at her. He slipped the silver coin back into his pocket, his expression completely unreadable, a stone-carved profile against the flashing red and amber emergency lights of the runway. I served a long time ago, Evelyn, in a unit that didn't officially exist. When you leave that world, they give you a token. It means if you ever knock on the door, they have to answer. That's all. Before she could press him further, a sharp streak of lightning ripped through the heavy clouds, followed instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that shook the SUV's heavy frame. The violent noise woke Lily. The little girl jolted upward in Evelyn's arms, her eyes wide with sudden terror. Looking out the window, she saw the chaotic swirl of spinning emergency beacons, high-powered floodlights cutting through the torrential downpour, and men in specialized hazard suits running blindly through the dark. The sheer sensory overload completely overwhelmed her. Lily let out a sharp, terrified sob, her small frame beginning to hyperventilate as she clutched her pewter fighter jet to her chest. Evelyn froze. A cold panic seized her throat. In the corporate world, she could handle a $20 million supply chain collapse without blinking, but holding a crying, panicking child made her feel utterly, helplessly incompetent. Her hands trembled against Lily's jacket. She didn't know what to say, what tone to use, or how to stop the tears that were now streaming down the little girl's face. The wealth, the power, the $60 million empire, none of it could buy her the ability to calm a frightened child. Adrian moved instantly. He didn't yell, and he didn't panic. He simply shifted his weight, turning around in the front seat to face them, and reached his large hand into the back. He didn't pull Lily away from Evelyn. Instead, he placed his palm gently over Lily's small, shaking hands, anchoring her. "Co-pilot, look at me," Adrian said. His voice was incredibly low, steady, and filled with an absolute, unshakable warmth that seemed to instantly counteract the screaming sirens outside. "Look right at my eyes, Lily." Lily hiccuped, her tear-filled eyes locking onto her father's face. "We're just passing through a heavy crosswind," Adrian said softly, his thumb gently tracing the back of her small hand. "The lights are just the ground crew setting up our runway. You're in the command cabin with Miss Evelyn, and she's the strongest captain I know. You're completely safe. Do you believe me?" Lily took a ragged breath, her chest slowly stopping its frantic heaving. She looked up at Evelyn, then back at her father, and nodded cleanly. "Yes, Daddy." "Keep holding that jet," Adrian murmured. "Keep the wings level for me." Evelyn watched the exchange in complete silence, her breath caught in her throat. The deep contrast between her own internal panic and Adrian's quiet, masculine security hit her with the force of a physical blow. She realized with a sudden pang of emotional vulnerability that she had spent her entire life surrounded by men who used their power to make everyone else feel small and anxious. Adrian used his strength to make a terrified little girl feel completely invincible. The SUV lurched to a halt outside Hangar 7. The structure was colossal, built of reinforced steel and concrete, with massive doors yawning open into the storm. Inside the hangar, a sleek, twin-engine experimental military transport aircraft was tilted dangerously to the left. Wisps of white hydraulic fluid vapor were spraying violently from the front nose assembly, and a dozen high-level engineers were arguing frantically around a digital diagnostic terminal, their faces painted with pure desperation. A man in a sharp, expensive tactical jacket, Director Arthur Sterling, the head of Aegis Aerospace Operations, was screaming orders over the din of the alarms. Adrian didn't wait. He turned to Evelyn, his eyes steady. "Stay in the vehicle with Lily. Keep the doors locked." He stepped out into the pouring rain, slamming the SUV door behind him. Evelyn watched through the dark tint of the glass as Adrian walked calmly into the bright, frantic chaos of the hangar. The moment Director Sterling caught sight of the wrinkled shirt and the rugged man walking toward him, his furious expression vanished, replaced instantly by a look of profound, breathless relief. The elite director of a multi-billion-dollar defense contractor literally ran across the concrete floor, grabbing Adrian by the arm, his posture completely submissive as he began pointing frantically at the failing aircraft. Evelyn rolled her window down just an inch, the roar of the wind and the screaming mechanics flooding into the quiet cabin of the SUV. "Commander Cole!" Director Sterling shouted over the alarms, his voice cracking with immense pressure. "Thank God you answered the line." The automated seal broke during the diagnostic test. The nose gear is locked at a 45-degree angle, and the secondary pressure line is spiking into the red zone. If that hydraulic reservoir ruptures, the volatile fluid will ignite the primary fuel cells. We have less than 4 minutes before this entire facility goes up in flames. The alarms inside Hangar 7 shifted from a rhythmic pulse to a flat, agonizing shriek that vibrated through the reinforced concrete floor. Overhead, the automated emergency strobes bathed the entire structure in a violent crimson wash. White vapor hissed furiously from the underbelly of the crippled experimental transport plane, obscuring the landing gear in a toxic, pressurized fog. Chief Engineer Preston Thorne stood at the primary diagnostic station, his face glistening with cold sweat. He was a man accustomed to luxury corporate lecture halls and multi-million-dollar research grants, his spotless white lab coat draped over a bespoke tailored suit. His fingers flew across the touchscreens in a blind panic. The digital override is completely unresponsive. Thorne yelled, his voice cracking with terror as he looked at the senior staff around him. The software is looping. We have less than 3 minutes before the pressure seals fail entirely. Clear the hangar. Abandon the asset. We can't abandon it, you idiot! Director Arthur Sterling roared back, his hands slamming onto the metal console. If that prototype vaporizes, it takes 3 city blocks of Blackwood Airport with it. Then there is nothing we can do, Thorne shouted, throwing his hands in the air. The automated sequence is locked. No civilian mechanic can bypass an Aegis defense firewall. He isn't a civilian mechanic, Sterling whispered. Adrian Cole stepped into the bright, frantic perimeter of the diagnostic bay. The rain had soaked through his wrinkled shirt, causing the fabric to cling to his broad shoulders. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace that completely defied the screaming alarms and the fleeing technicians. He didn't look at the flashing red monitors. He looked directly at the physical hardware of the aircraft. Thorne blocked his path, his expression twisting into a sneer born of pure, desperate arrogance. Who the hell let this laborer into a classified hot zone? Get this man out of here. He's gonna get us all killed. Director Sterling didn't just step in. He violently grabbed Thorne by the shoulder of his expensive lab coat, twisting him around with a force that sent the chief engineer stumbling backward against a row of tool carts. "Shut your mouth, Preston!" Sterling bellowed, his voice echoing over the sirens, drawing the stunned eyes of every remaining junior engineer in the room. "You are speaking to the man who designed the entire mechanical foundation of the Vanguard project before you even drew a breath in this industry. If he tells you to burn your degrees, you find a match." Thorne's jaw went completely slack. His face turned an asymmetric shade of white as he looked from his powerful director to the rugged man standing in the grease-stained corridor. The junior technicians froze, completely paralyzed by the sudden, absolute humiliation of their prestigious chief engineer. Adrian didn't spare them a second glance. He pulled his heavy leather work gloves from his belt and slid them over his calloused hands. Thorne's software patches overloaded the auxiliary bypass. The computer isn't looping, it's suffocating. "Bring me a 40mm manual torque wrench and a titanium pressure clip. Now." Thorne stood frozen, his aristocratic pride utterly shattered in front of his entire staff. "Did you hear him?" Sterling barked at Thorne, his finger pointing aggressively at the deck. "Get on your knees and pull the manual kit from the lower locker. Move!" In a public display of complete subjection, the highly paid, globally recognized chief engineer Preston Thorne dropped directly onto the oil-slicked concrete floor. His hand shook violently as he scrambled beneath the primary console, tearing open the heavy steel lockbox. He emerged drenched in sweat, holding the massive, heavy torque wrench up toward Adrian like a servant offering a sword to a king. Adrian snatched the tool from his hands without acknowledging his existence. From the safety of the reinforced SUV, Evelyn Carter watched the entire scene unfold through the glass. Her hands were still wrapped around Lily, who had quietly nestled her head against Evelyn's shoulder. The child's breathing was completely peaceful now, her small fingers lightly resting on Evelyn's expensive silver bracelet. Evelyn's mind was racing, her chest tight with an emotion she hadn't experienced in decades. She looked at the elite defense director treating Adrian like a deity. She looked at the arrogant chief engineer groveling on the floor. For years, Evelyn had believed that money was the ultimate arbiter of power. She had believed that her $60 million logistics firm and her untouchable social standing were the only things keeping her safe from a world that wanted to exploit her. But watching Adrian walk directly into the jaws of a potential explosion, completely calm, entirely grounded, she realized how hollow her fortress truly was. When the world truly caught fire, her wealth couldn't buy a second of peace. Her corporate influence couldn't stabilize a failing system. Adrian possessed a heavy, silent masculinity that didn't require a boardroom or a bank account to command respect. He simply was the safety in the room. "Daddy's going to fix the big plane now," Lily whispered, her small voice breaking Evelyn out of her trance. The little girl wasn't looking at the fire or the flashing lights. She was looking at her father with absolute, unshakable trust. "He always makes the loud noises go away." Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Yes, sweetie, he does." Underneath the aircraft, the crisis reached its absolute zenith. A sharp, metallic crack echoed from the nose gear as the primary hydraulic casing began to split under the immense pressure. A jet of superheated fluid hissed outward, burning through a nearby rubber conduit. Adrian didn't flinch. He slid beneath the tilting frame of the $30 million airframe, his boots sliding through the slick, pooling water. He threw his weight against the manual release valve, his muscles straining against the locked steel mechanism. The metal groaned. The digital countdown on the hangar wall flashed, 45 seconds. With a final explosive surge of brute strength, Adrian wrenched the valve clockwise. A massive, deafening roar of green pressure vapor erupted from the relief exhaust, shooting upward into the hangar's ventilation system. Instantly, the flat shriek of the alarms died. The flashing red strobe light snapped over to a quiet, solid amber, and then, with a soft electronic chime, the entire hangar flooded with standard, cool white illumination. The aircraft slowly settled back onto its primary leveling struts, completely stabilized. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of the engineers who had just escaped death. Adrian slid out from beneath the fuselage, his shirt now stained with dark hydraulic oil, the pencil still tucked perfectly behind his ear. He handed the heavy torque wrench back to Director Sterling, his face entirely devoid of pride or excitement. Before Sterling could utter a word of gratitude, the heavy security doors at the back of the hangar hissed open. A sleek, midnight black Federal sedan tore across the concrete floor, its tires screeching to a halt just inches from Adrian. A tall man in a dark government trench coat stepped out, his expression grim as he held an encrypted satellite tablet in his hand. He walked past the directors, past the engineers, and stopped directly in front of Adrian, ignoring the grease and the oil. "Commander Cole," the federal agent said, his voice cutting through the quiet room like ice. "We have a Class 1 military transport emergency over the Atlantic. Your retirement just ended." The heavy hangar doors rattled violently as another wave of thunder crashed directly overhead. Inside, the brilliant white floodlights illuminated the glossy black hood of the Federal sedan. Agent Silas Kincaid stood motionless, his dark trench coat dripping rainwater onto the concrete floor. His eyes locked onto Adrian Cole with an intensity that made the surrounding Aegis executives step back into the shadows. Adrian didn't move. He stood there, his oil-stained work shirt clinging to his frame, the manual torque wrench still heavy in his gloved hand. The absolute silence that had fallen over the hangar was broken only by the electronic hum of the stabilized aircraft behind him. "You have the wrong hangar, Agent Kincaid," Adrian said, his voice entirely flat, devoid of any emotion. "My active service contract ended 5 years ago. I build residential homes now. I have a wall to frame at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." Kincaid didn't argue. He simply stepped closer, turning the encrypted satellite tablet around so the glowing screen faced Adrian. On the display, a bright crimson flight path was blinking erratically over a dense mass of swirling green and purple radar weather signatures. An ultra-high-altitude stealth transport designation Apex 7 lost its primary and auxiliary navigation arrays when the superstorm hit the coastline, Kincaid said, keeping his voice low but completely commanding. "They are flying entirely blind at 30,000 feet. Trapped in a severe downburst. Their electrical systems are fried, their fuel cells are draining at double the standard rate, and they have exactly 35 minutes before they suffer a total structural collapse in midair." Chief Engineer Preston Thorne, still nursing his bruised pride near the diagnostic console, let out a nervous breath. If their digital arrays are completely gone, they can't utilize the automated instrument landing system. In this visibility, it's a statistical impossibility to find the runway. "They're dead men." "They don't have to be," Kincaid countered, his eyes never leaving Adrian's face. "The pilot on that aircraft is executing a standard emergency holding pattern, but he's losing the fight against the crosswinds. We don't need a pilot in the sky to save them, Thorne. We need the man who wrote the manual code for the emergency ground control override. We need the ghost of Falcon Ridge." "We need you, Commander." The term echoed through the massive hangar. Director Arthur Sterling stood completely paralyzed, his mouth slightly open as the true identity of the man standing before him finally crystallized. The elite mechanics and junior technicians watched in stunned reverence, suddenly realizing that the humble contractor they had looked down upon was a living legend within the black-budget defense matrix. From the relative safety of the luxury SUV, Evelyn Carter pulled the vehicle's heavy door open slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear every word. The rain lashed against her face, but she didn't care. Her eyes were fixed entirely on Adrian. She looked down at Lily, who was still cradled gently against her shoulder, her small hand tightly wrapping around Evelyn's expensive silver bracelet. The little girl was completely safe, entirely calm, trusting her father so deeply that even the arrival of federal agents couldn't shake her peace. Evelyn felt a sudden, profound wave of emotional vulnerability wash over her. For 5 long years, she had built her $60 million logistics empire on the belief that she was entirely self-sufficient. She had surrounded herself with men like Julian Vance, men who wore pristine Italian suits, held massive bank accounts, and used their influence to make everyone else feel small, anxious, and replaceable. She had mistaken their arrogance for strength, and she had built her own cold armor to match it. But looking at Adrian now, standing firmly between the federal government and his child, his clothes stained with grease, his face etched with pure exhaustion, she saw what true, grounded masculinity looked like. Adrian didn't need a title, a bespoke suit, or a public relations team to hold the center of gravity in a room full of powerful people. He possessed an unshakable inner authority that money simply could not buy. He was the only source of absolute safety in a world that was rapidly catching fire. Adrian slowly peeled the heavy leather work gloves from his hands and tossed them onto a tool cart. He looked back toward the SUV, his eyes meeting Evelyn's through the rain-streaked dark. For a long, silent moment, the two of them just looked at each other. There was no performance, no negotiation, just a silent, mutual understanding. Adrian walked over to the vehicle, his steps heavy and deliberate. He leaned into the cabin, his voice dropping into that soft, reassuring rumble that instantly stabilized everything around him. "Evelyn," Adrian murmured gently, "I need to go up to the primary air traffic control tower. The backup ground radar grid is failing, and I have to map the blind landing vectors manually to bring that plane down. I can't take Lily into the operations center. It's too chaotic." Evelyn didn't hesitate for a single second. Her hands, which had trembled with panic just 20 minutes ago, were suddenly steady. She wrapped her arms more securely around Lily, looking up at Adrian with a profound intensity. "Go," Evelyn said softly, her corporate ice entirely melted, leaving only raw, genuine determination. "She stays with me. I won't let anything happen to her, Adrian. I promise you." Lily looked up, her bright eyes shining under the vehicle's interior lights. "You're going to fix the big plane in the sky now, Daddy?" "That's right, co-pilot," Adrian smiled, a brief, warm flash of light across his rugged face as he touched her cheek. "Keep the wings level for Miss Evelyn." Adrian stood up, his posture instantly snapping back into that of a terrifyingly authoritative military commander. He turned toward Agent Kincaid, his face completely hardened into stone. "Activate the tactical telemetry uplink in the main tower. I want a direct voice channel to the cockpit of Apex 7 on an encrypted VHF frequency." "It's already booting up, sir," Kincaid said, stepping aside to clear the path. "But there's one more thing you need to know before we go up there. The passenger manifest on that transport just cleared the secondary federal encryption block." Adrian paused, his eyebrows narrowing. "Who is on that plane, Silas?" Kincaid glanced briefly toward Evelyn, an expression of grim sympathy crossing his features. "It's a civilian-military joint venture flight, Commander. The primary corporate investors who funded the prototype airframe are on board tonight. It's the Global Executive Board of Directors for Vanguard Logistics, the international conglomerate that currently controls the hostile takeover bid for Evelyn Carter's firm." Evelyn gasped, her breath catching violently in her throat as the world seemed to spin beneath her feet. The very people who held the survival of her life's work in their hands were currently suffocating in a blind aircraft 30,000 feet above her head, and the only man who could save them was the single father she had almost walked away from. Agent Silas Kincaid gestured sharply toward the reinforced elevator at the base of the primary air traffic control tower. "Ma'am, the hangar perimeter is no longer secure with the volatile fumes venting. My team will escort you and the child to the secure observation suite directly adjacent to the command deck. You'll be safe there." Evelyn didn't argue. She stepped out of the SUV, holding Lily firmly against her chest, shielding the little girl's face from the driving rain with the hem of her cashmere coat. As the elevator surged upward through the steel core of the tower, she could feel the vibration of the storm rattling the structure. Lily didn't cry. She kept her small face buried in Evelyn's neck, her tiny breaths warm against Evelyn's skin. The profound weight of responsibility shifted something deep within Evelyn's chest. The pristine, untouchable corporate executive had completely vanished, replaced by a fiercely protective guardian. The elevator doors hissed open onto the primary operations deck of Blackwood Command. The room was a massive, circular glass dome overlooking the pitch-black runways, illuminated by dozens of glowing radar consoles and tactical displays. The atmosphere inside was frantic. Over 30 high-ranking air traffic controllers, military liaison officers, and federal technicians were shouting over the din of static-laced radio feeds. At the center of the room stood General Raymond Cross, the commander of the Regional Aerospace Defense Sector. His uniform was immaculate, covered in silver stars and commendations, but his face was drawn and pale as he stared at a massive central display showing a single, dying green blip on the tracking grid. "We just lost their secondary transponder," a technician screamed, his hands flying across a keyboard. "Apex 7 is dropping altitude rapidly. They're down to 12,000 feet, caught in the eye of the downburst. Visibility is 0. Get me a voice channel," General Cross ordered, his voice tight with immense pressure. "Any channel." Adrian Cole stepped onto the command deck, his oil-stained work shirt and mud-flecked boots a striking, impossible contrast to the sea of pristine military uniforms and sharp federal suits. A young security officer immediately stepped into his path, reaching for his sidearm. "Sir, this is a restricted tactical command tier. You need to step back." "Stand down, Lieutenant." General Cross's voice thundered across the room, instantly silencing the chaotic chatter of the entire deck. The general turned, his eyes locking onto Adrian. In a flash of absolute, unscripted reverence that sent a shockwave through the junior staff, the decorated general took 3 swift steps forward and stood at rigid attention, snapping his hand to his brow in a flawless military salute. "Commander Cole, thank God you're here. The system is completely blind. We have 32 souls on that transport, and we are out of options." Adrian didn't salute back. He simply stepped past the general, his presence instantly dominating the entire circular room. The quiet, humble contractor who had sat across from Evelyn in a neighborhood diner had vanished entirely. In his place stood a mountain of quiet masculinity and absolute command. "Cut the automated tracking loops," Adrian commanded, his voice ringing out with an icy, unshakable authority that made every technician freeze. The storm's electromagnetic field is bouncing off the aluminum hull, creating a false radar echo. "You're tracking a ghost. Switch the primary array to localized thermal imaging and look for the heat signature of the auxiliary power unit." A technician hesitated, looking up at General Cross. "Do exactly what he says," the general barked. "Now." The technician struck a sequence of keys. Instantly, the chaotic fractured green lines on the main screen dissolved, replaced by a sharp, glowing infrared image of a massive twin-engine aircraft struggling against violent air currents just miles from the airfield. The entire room let out a collective, breathless gasp. Through the thick, reinforced glass of the secure observation suite just 20 feet away, Evelyn watched the scene unfold. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so violently she could hear it over the electronic hum of the equipment. She looked at the decorated general, deferring completely to Adrian. She looked at the room full of elite federal agents waiting on his every word. The sheer magnitude of the power reversal was dizzying. Just an hour ago, Julian Vance had tried to humiliate this man, calling him maintenance staff, treating him like an invisible piece of the city's plumbing. Yet here, in the hidden heart of the nation's defense apparatus, Adrian Cole was the undisputed sovereign. Her $60 million empire, her ruthless business negotiations, her expensive armor, all of it felt entirely microscopic compared to the heavy, silent weight of the man standing at the center of that command circle. Suddenly, the primary communications console erupted with a blast of violent static. A frantic, terror-stricken voice cut through the speaker, echoing across the deck. "Blackwood Command, this is Captain Charles Miller aboard Apex 7. The pilot screamed, the sound of roaring wind and mechanical stress groaning loudly in the background. "We have total instrument failure. The manual controls are sluggish, and the elevator lines are freezing over. We can't see the runway. We need emergency vectors or we are going to impact the terrain." Before Adrian could reach the microphone, a second voice cut into the frequency, sharp, breathless, and laced with the toxic, demanding arrogance of an elite billionaire who believed his wealth could buy his way out of a fatal plunge. "Listen to me, Blackwood," the voice shrieked, instantly recognizable to Evelyn's ears. It was Franklin Montgomery, the global chairman of Vanguard Logistics, the man spearheading the hostile takeover to destroy her life's work. "I don't care about your military protocols. I am paying $40 million for this prototype airframe. My board of directors is on this aircraft. Secure a commercial landing path immediately. I will destroy every single one of your careers if you don't get this plane on the ground." The command deck went deathly quiet. The technicians looked at each other in sheer panic, completely paralyzed by the billionaire's screaming threats. Adrian Cole didn't blink. He calmly stepped up to the primary communications terminal, pressed the black transmitter button with his large, calloused thumb, and spoke into the microphone. His voice was a low, chillingly steady alpine frost that instantly shattered the billionaire's frantic hysteria. "Mr. Montgomery," Adrian said, his tone carrying an absolute terrifying weight. "Your $40 million cannot buy a single foot of visibility in this storm, and your board of directors is currently flying inside a coffin. If you want to survive the next 10 minutes, you will take your hands off the cockpit console, sit down in your expensive leather seat, and shut your mouth. You have no authority in my sky." The silence that followed Adrian's voice on the radio feed was absolute. Over the communication line, the heavy breathing of Captain Miller was the only sound, punctuated by the structural groans of the staggering aircraft. Franklin Montgomery did not speak again. The billionaire chairman had been thoroughly silenced, stripped of his corporate leverage by a man who didn't care about his net worth. Adrian didn't waste a single heartbeat. He leaned over the primary terminal, his calloused hands operating the manual analog dials with a fluid, memory-mapped precision. "Captain Miller, listen to my voice," Adrian said, his tone dropping into a steady, hypnotic rhythm. "The automated glide slope is lying to you. Your internal sensors are reading the atmospheric pressure inside the eye of the storm. Disregard your primary flight display. You are currently 300 feet lower than your dashboard indicates." "Copy, Commander." Miller's voice cracked, thick with adrenaline. "But I'm flying into a wall of black. I have no visual on the approach lights." "You don't need them," Adrian replied calmly. "I am your eyes now. Lower your flaps to 30 degrees. Reduce your airspeed to 140. You're going to feel a violent thermal downburst in exactly 5 seconds. When the left wing drops, do not fight it with the digital trims. Hold the yoke steady and let the gravity pocket carry you through. Trust the iron, Captain." Through the thick glass of the secure suite, Evelyn held her breath, her fingers tightening around Lily's small hand. She watched Adrian's back. His broad shoulders were square, unmoving under the tremendous pressure of 32 lives hanging in the balance. On the central thermal screen, the glowing orange silhouette of Apex 7 plunged violently. The junior technicians gasped, several of them covering their mouths as the aircraft appeared to drop straight toward the dark perimeter ridge. For a terrifying 3 seconds, the plane plummeted. Then, exactly as Adrian had predicted, the aircraft stabilized, slicing cleanly through the crosswind and aligning perfectly with the invisible centerline of runway 3. Touchdown in 5, 4, 3. Adrian counted down, his voice completely level. A distant, muffled screech of burning rubber echoed through the heavy glass of the tower. On the main tracking monitor, the thermal image of the experimental transport plane touched the deck, its reverse thrusters erupting in a brilliant plume of heat as it safely decelerated along the rain-slicked runway. For a long moment, the entire command deck remained completely frozen, unable to process the impossible feat they had just witnessed. Then, an explosive roar of cheers shattered the room. Technicians threw their headsets onto the consoles, military officers embraced, and General Raymond Cross let out a massive breath, his hand shaking slightly as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Adrian Cole did not join the celebration. He slowly let go of the communication transmitter, stepped back from the console, and quietly pulled the wooden pencil from behind his ear, slipping it into his pocket. The chilling, authoritative commander dissolved back into the quiet, humble single father. General Cross stepped forward, his eyes filled with a profound, unshakable reverence. "Commander, in my 30 years of service, I have never seen a manual vector map executed like that. You just pulled 32 people out of a burning grave." "They're on the ground, General. That's all that matters," Adrian said softly. He didn't wait for a medal or a round of handshakes. He turned his back on the cheering elite of the defense sector and walked directly toward the secure observation suite. The heavy glass doors slid open. The moment Adrian stepped inside, Lily released Evelyn's hand and ran forward, her small yellow raincoat rustling. "Daddy!" Adrian dropped to his knees, catching his daughter in his arms and lifting her against his chest. He buried his face in her dark hair, his large frame finally exhaling the heavy tension he had carried since entering the airfield. "I'm right here, sweet girl. The plane is safe." Evelyn stood up slowly from her seat, her movements hesitant, her heart twisting in her chest. The cold, unapproachable corporate armor she had worn for more than a decade had been completely dismantled. She looked at Adrian, his shirt soaked with sweat and stained with hydraulic grease, holding his daughter with a tender, protective warmth that made her throat tighten with raw emotion. She had spent her adult life believing that true security was something you built with lawyers, ironclad contracts, and tens of millions of dollars in a corporate bank account. She had treated everyone around her as a potential adversary, always waiting for the hidden angle, always guarding against the inevitable betrayal. But looking at Adrian now, she realized the profound tragedy of her own success. She had everything the world could offer: wealth, prestige, power, except peace. And this man, who lived in a modest house and drove a rusted truck, carried an absolute unshakable safety within his very soul without even trying. Adrian stood up, holding Lily securely on his hip, and turned his deep, steady eyes toward Evelyn. The silence between them grew thick, charged with a powerful, unspoken, emotional intensity. "Thank you, Evelyn," Adrian said softly, his voice rich and genuine. "You kept her safe for me." Evelyn took a step closer, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out, her fingers lightly brushing against the damp fabric of his shoulder. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I didn't do anything, Adrian. You saved everyone. You saved the people who are trying to destroy my life." "They're just men in a storm, Evelyn," Adrian murmured, his gaze locking onto hers with a warmth that seemed to melt the final defenses around her heart. "Out here, their titles don't carry any weight. Only the foundation matters." Before Evelyn could answer, the heavy security elevator at the back of the command deck hissed open. A group of security guards stepped out, flanking a man whose expensive bespoke suit was completely ruined, his silk tie crooked, and his face a mask of pale, sweating terror. It was Franklin Montgomery, the global chairman of Vanguard Logistics. He was shaking violently, clutching a gold-plated pen as he pushed past the staff, his arrogant voice echoing across the room. "Where is he?" Montgomery demanded hysterically, his eyes darting frantically around the tower. "Where is the commander who took over the radio? I am going to buy him out of his contract. I will pay him $5 million right now to join my personal executive security force." "Where is he?" General Cross pointed a cold, silent finger toward the observation suite. Franklin Montgomery turned sharply, his arrogant stride faltering as he walked into the suite. He stopped dead in his tracks, his jaw dropping in absolute shock as his eyes traveled from the grease-stained contractor to the unmistakable face of Evelyn Carter standing right beside him. Franklin Montgomery stopped so abruptly his polished leather shoes skidded against the sleek floor of the observation suite. The billionaire chairman of Vanguard Logistics looked at Adrian Cole's grease-stained clothes. Then, at the protective way, the rugged contractor held 5-year-old Lily against his shoulder, and finally at Evelyn Carter. The manic, commanding arrogance that had defined Montgomery's voice over the radio completely crumbled into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. "Carter?" Montgomery stammered, his face flushing deep crimson as he adjusted his crooked silk tie. "What is the meaning of this? Why are you in a restricted military command tower? And who? Who is this laborer?" "I demanded to see the commander who just mapped our landing vectors." Director Arthur Sterling stepped into the suite, his expression cold and devoid of the corporate subservience Montgomery was accustomed to. "You are looking at him, Mr. Montgomery. This is Commander Adrian Cole. He designed the mechanical framework of the aircraft you were just suffocating in." Montgomery blinked rapidly, his eyes darting between Adrian's weathered work shirt and the gold-plated fountain pen he was still clutching like a weapon. He let out a forced, high-pitched laugh, trying desperately to regain his footing. "A mechanic? The man is wearing a tool belt, Sterling. I don't care what his history is. Listen to me, fellow. I just watched my life flash before my eyes up there. I am a man of immense resources. I am offering you $5 million right now to walk out of this airfield and become the chief of global security and transport execution for Vanguard Logistics. You name your price, and I double it." Adrian didn't flinch. He didn't look at the gold pen, and he didn't look at the imaginary checkbook Montgomery was throwing around. He simply shifted Lily more securely against his hip, his deep, steady eyes locking onto the billionaire with a quiet, terrifying masculinity that made Montgomery's voice die in his throat. "Mr. Montgomery," Adrian said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried the absolute weight of a mountain. "You still think everything in this world has a price tag attached to it. You think because you can buy an airframe, you can buy the sky. But when the engines fail and the storm hits, your millions are nothing but heavy paper pulling you down faster. I don't work for your salary. And I don't work for men who scream at pilots while people are trying to keep them alive." Agent Silas Kincaid stepped forward from the shadows of the command deck, a thick, encrypted federal folder held firmly in his hand, his eyes fixed on Montgomery with chilling precision. Furthermore, Mr. Montgomery, your behavior in the cockpit during a Class 1 military transport emergency constitutes a direct violation of federal aviation defense protocols. You intentionally compromised the pilot's focus during an active emergency ground control override. Montgomery's face drained of color, turning a ghostly, asymmetric shade of white. Do you know who I am? I am the primary civilian investor in the Vanguard Defense Project. My firm is currently finalizing a multi-million-dollar acquisition of Carter Logistics to streamline the national routing corridor. Not anymore, you aren't, Agent Kincaid said coldly. He opened the folder, presenting a document stamped with a dark red federal seal. Under Section 9 of the National Defense Civil Security Act, any civilian entity that demonstrates reckless endangerment inside a black budget prototype automatically forfeits their operational integration clearance. The federal government is stripping Vanguard Logistics of its transport routing rights out of Blackwood Airport, effective immediately. Montgomery staggered backward, his hands trembling violently as the gold-plated pen slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the floor. His entire empire, the hostile takeover he had spent months orchestrating to crush Evelyn Carter, was evaporating in a single breath. You can't do this. If Vanguard loses those routing rights, our stock will collapse by morning. The defense corridor needs a licensed logistics partner to handle the freight. Adrian turned his head slightly, his gaze drifting over to Evelyn. The silence in the room became thick, charged with an incredible, unscripted, emotional intensity. Evelyn stood entirely still, her breath caught in her throat, her chest aching with a profound wave of vulnerability as she looked into the eyes of the single father she had almost pushed out of her life. The corridor does need a partner, Adrian said quietly, his voice echoing across the silent command deck. He looked back at General Cross and Director Sterling. And the government needs a firm with a flawless operational safety record. A firm run by someone who understands that people matter more than the margin. Carter Logistics already manages the regional freight lines. Transfer the primary Aegis defense routing contracts to Evelyn Carter's name. Director Sterling nodded without a second of hesitation. Consider it done, Commander. The paperwork will be finalized before sunrise. Montgomery let out a desperate, strangled sound, his aristocratic pride utterly shattered in front of the entire military and federal apparatus. Two security officers stepped forward, wrapping their gloved hands firmly around the billionaire's arms and guiding him toward the elevator. The man who had entered the tower believing his wealth made him a god was led away in complete public disgrace, thoroughly humiliated by the silent strength of a man who worked with his hands. Slowly, the frantic energy of the command deck began to thin out. The technicians returned to their standard monitoring duties, the alarms faded to a gentle hum, and the heavy, torrential rain outside the glass dome began to slow, transitioning into a quiet, patient mist. Through the high eastern windows of the tower, the first faint, golden lines of the morning dawn began to break through the dark storm clouds. Evelyn walked slowly toward Adrian. The $2,000 cashmere coat was damp, her expensive watch was hidden beneath her sleeve, and the colorless, unapproachable corporate armor she had worn for years had completely dissolved. She was just herself, standing in the quiet light of the morning, entirely exposed. Adrian, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly as a single genuine tear tracked down her cheek. You saved my company. You destroyed the takeover. Why would you do that for me after? After how I treated you? Adrian set Lily down gently on her feet. The little girl instantly reached out, her small fingers wrapping around Evelyn's hand, holding it with an unshakable, trusting warmth. Adrian stepped closer, his rugged frame casting a long, protective shadow over both of them. He reached out his large, calloused hand, his thumb gently wiping the tear from Evelyn's cheek. His touch was incredibly warm, grounded, and steady. I didn't save your company, Evelyn, Adrian murmured, his deep eyes burning with a soft, undeniable affection that made her heart swell with absolute peace. Your company stays outside the door, remember? That was our rule. I removed a wall that was getting in your way because you deserve to build something honest without being afraid of the storm. Evelyn let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 4 long years. She leaned into his touch, her hand resting firmly against his chest, feeling the heavy, rhythmic beat of his heart. For the first time in her adult life, she didn't feel the need to calculate, to negotiate, or to measure her worth in the world. She had found a safe harbor, a quiet masculinity that offered absolute security without asking for a single thing in return. "I'm ready," Evelyn said softly, looking up into his eyes as the golden dawn flooded the room. "No more armor. No more testing. I want to build something with you, Adrian, evenly." Adrian smiled, a quiet, tired, but completely radiant smile that lit up his rugged features. He reached down, lifting Lily back into his arms, and wrapped his other hand securely around Evelyn's waist, pulling her close as they walked together toward the elevator, leaving the powerful elite behind them. The storm had finally passed, and for the first time, the future looked entirely bright.